Okay. All right. Welcome back to Walking and Talking. I'm Professor Schertz. I'll be walking and talking. No, I'm kidding. Hi. I'm both walking and talking, but this is another lecture for Humanities 1. As I have been doing them while I work out, I have incentive to keep working out. What happens when I finish with all the lectures I need to record for this class? Clearly, I will stop working out and start gaining weight again. No, I'll just have to find something else to do, I suppose. I have no idea. Frankly, I'm scared. I'm scared. Help me. No. Anyway. Last time we talked about the fall, we talked about the Roman Republic from the beginning to the fall, quite frankly. The whole damn thing. Uh, and that's fine. I don't need the book and the video I linked in the description go into plenty of details about events and names and dates. I'm trying to paint the broad strokes here. This is not I'm not trying to get into the weeds. I'm trying to show you the sort of the sweep and the scope of history so you understand how it all fits together. All right. So, the imperial period in Rome is the next bit. Octavian, Julius Caesar's nephew, whom he adopted as a son in his will, and to whom he left his fortune, defeated the various factions vying for power in the wake of Caesar's assassination. It took a while, but he did it. And ultimately, he became the first emperor of Rome. That is to say, and he changed his name to Augustus. So Augustus is the first emperor, not Caesar. Julius Caesar is not an emperor. He was a former consul. He was a governor of Gaul. He came back and had himself granted dictatorial powers for life. So in a sense, he was like an emperor. He was like a proto-emperor, but he was not an emperor. He was the emperor, if you will. Anyway, I'm just going to have fun coming up with different things to call him that aren't emperor, because he wasn't. Don't tell me that Julius Caesar was an emperor. He was not. Augustus was the first emperor of Rome. So, the imperial period is characterized by a number of features. First of all, the emperor had effectively all power. He could do whatever the hell he wanted. But at the same time, the forms of the Roman Republican government were observed at first. The Senate still met. The other political offices were still filled, and so on and so forth. It's just that nobody did a damn thing without the emperor's say-so. In other words, again, I like to say this a lot. I use this joke a lot, but it's a very effective one for getting my point across, I think. It's not like big letters appeared in the sky and said, it's now Imperial Rome. And everyone's like, oh, shit, let's go home. Right? That's not what happened. The changeover is a process. And yes, in a way, you could look at, the last 100 years of the Republic as part of that process, right? From the moment that Sulla, the General Sulla, marched his armies into Rome and began slaughtering his political opponents just to restore stability and peace, then, the institutions of Rome were all over with at that point, right? How are you going to have faith in the Senate to pass resolutions for the governance of Rome and the the elections to elect officials that keep everything running. How is respect for the rule of law going to continue once people stop showing it respect? Right? I mean, that's the thing that is so hard to communicate, I think. We all just take for granted that we live under the rule of law. And if someone does something illegal, we go, you can't do that. Well, that's the thing. They can do it. But the only way they'll be stopped from doing it or punished from doing it is if the other people involved in the system decide to actually stop them. I mean, imagine a small town where the judge just decided not to, they've only got one judge, and the judge just decided to throw out every case, right? It doesn't matter who they arrest or for what. The judge just says, case dismissed, I don't care. It's all done, right? What would they do? I mean, they'd try to get rid of the judge, probably, like he's not doing his job or what have you. But until then, the system is just broken, right? People can do whatever they want. The law has no meaning at that point. Imagine a little town, right, not so long ago, right? You can imagine it like this, where the rule of law is usually functional, but sometimes when people feel like it, they just go out and kill the person that they think has done something wrong. And it doesn't matter, because the local authorities don't arrest them for it. And the local judges won't prosecute them for it. Or won't, hear the case, and the prosecutors won't prosecute them. So on and so forth. The rule of law is undermined. The institutions are undermined. The institutions of society are only as effective as our willingness to play along with them. That's just the flat truth. So as soon as Sulla said, forget about trying to solve these problems politically, the unrest of the plebeian class and the recalcitrance of the nobility, forget about trying to solve these problems politically. I'm just going to kill everybody until they stop making trouble. I mean, that's it. That's the slow slide. That's the beginning of the slide into authoritarianism, into ultimately autocracy, where there is no rule of law. There's just the will of the autocrat. So, okay. It takes time, though. These Republican institutions had lasted for hundreds of years, and they didn't go away all at once. Julius Caesar, who did not call himself an emperor and was not an emperor but had a lot of dictatorial power, Julius Caesar still had the Senate meet, right? The Senate still met. He even added people to the Senate, right? What do we need the Senate for? We have a dictator who's all powerful. Well, the forms must be observed, right? If the dictator allows the Senate to do whatever it does, unless it crosses him, then, unless it makes him angry, then it looks a whole lot to an outside observer, to a regular person on the streets, it looks a whole lot as though things are running normally. The Senate is meeting, it's doing its business, it's passing resolutions. What do you want from us? Well, yeah, that's fine, except for if the Senate passes something that Caesar doesn't like, he'll kill them. Or better yet, it's all invisible and behind the scenes, because they know what Caesar wants, and he's met with them privately, and they just won't pass anything that would make him angry. It looks like business as usual. It looks like normal functioning of the Republican institutions of Rome. But it's not. It is absolutely not. So, Caesar gets assassinated. Octavian beats all comers, changes his name to Augustus, becomes the first emperor. That is a significant material change, but even then, a lot of the Republican institutions still survive, at least in name, at least in form, at least in appearance. The change was gradual. But Augustus was definitely an autocrat. One of the first things he did was to declare that his adopted father, Julius Caesar, be deified as a god. He himself would later be deified as a god after his death. Divus Imperator, the divine emperor. That's a feature of an autocracy, right? That sounds a lot like those Mesopotamian autocracies, where the autocrat claimed to be descended from the gods, or in the case of Egypt, an actual god. Okay, so yeah, you see the features of autocracy here. They were able to sustain an autocracy at this point because Rome by now was humongous, had enormous amounts of wealth. That wealth was, if you recall, one of the sticking points, the fact that caused the political chaos in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE. That was the fact that the vastly and swiftly growing wealth of Rome was being massively funneled to the people who were already wealthy, thanks to the inherent and structural imbalances in the system that favored the upper classes. And the lower classes had been agitating for reform. And the wealthy, who were getting much wealthier, thanks to this imbalance, were like, no, thank you. We do not wish to reform anything. We're fine. Bring me some more, I don't know, solid gold grapes or whatever the hell you buy when you're super rich. I wouldn't know. Anyway, the imperial era suffered, well, all right, let me start by saying this. The period under Augustus was sometimes known as the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome, because it was a prosperous period, at least relatively so. Anything would probably look prosperous compared to the chaos of the last century and a half. So I want to caution people, who are like, oh, Augustus, an autocrat isn't always bad. Well, okay, like it's better than sheer chaos, maybe, depends on your point of view. But a lot of Rome's problems stabilized under Augustus. He was a smart guy. He was an effective ruler. But the problem is, if he hadn't have been, there would have been no way to do anything about it, because the rule of law has already been destroyed, right? What are you going to do with a bad consul in Republican Rome? Well, there's ways to chuck him out of office. If you have a bad censor or a bad quaestor or a bad aedile, one of the various offices, right? Some government official, if they're not doing their job well, there are ways to get rid of them under the law. But if you've already chucked the law out the window, right? If the emperor is basically saying, someone says, oh, the law says you can't do that. And he goes, I'm the emperor, bitch. I can do whatever I want. How are you going to come to him and say, well, look, you should have done this and you didn't, so we're going to vote you out? And he's like, oh, snap, I guess I'm out. No, he's the emperor. He can do whatever he wants, right? Once the rule of law is gone, all the checks are gone, right? There's no way to do anything about a bad emperor. Augustus was not a bad emperor in many ways. In some ways, he was very conservative and regressive. He passed a lot of laws that, in the name of protecting women, that sort of restricted their rights. So he was a patriarchal little son of a bitch, but, you know, he did a lot to stabilize Rome's economy, its foreign relations, and so on and so forth. So that was good. But the people who came after him were so-so, right, at best. And here we get to the fundamental problem of autocracy. You have a bad ruler, what can you do about it? Well, we'll see shortly. The emperors that followed, it was not immediately, the position of emperor was not immediately a directly inherited position. It was not like father to son, not right away. Augustus chose his successor before he died, and it was, I believe, a cousin or a nephew. Because he didn't want to be seen as a king. Remember how the Romans felt about kings. They ran the last one out on the rail, killed him, you know. So, Romans were not wild about kings. And he wanted to avoid association with that, even though he was the emperor. He understood all too well that there were more poor people than there were rich people, and that if the poor people really got it in their head to riot, problems would ensue. So, the next few emperors were middling at best, until we start getting to the really bad ones, like Nero, right? Nero, you may have heard of him. Famously, they say that he fiddled while Rome burned. That he basically, there was a big fire in Rome. The emperor was seen as not doing much about it. He was known to love music, so blah blah blah. Nero fiddles while Rome burns. There you have it. The emperors were not. You hit a variety of emperors that are, you know, maybe decent, not great. Until we get to the second century CE. And we have a crisis period where instability strikes with regards to Rome. It's suffering problems in the foreign arena. They're suffering economic issues. I could have predicted that personally. Autocracy is not good for trade. But anyway. And basically someone straight up murders an emperor. They should have seen it coming. How else are you going to get a bad emperor out of office? Right? What are you going to do with it? Vote to get him out? The institutions are toast, man. The emperor has all the power. It's not going to happen. So, they enter into a crisis period, the crisis of the 2nd century, and it's bad. It's real bad. There's instability. It looks just like the old days, right? Sulla killed everybody and installed himself as a tyrant because he wanted to keep the peace, basically. He didn't necessarily want to change the system. He just wanted rioting and shit like that to stop. Caesar marched on Rome, had himself granted dictatorial powers for life so that he could change the system to be stable and effective in the way that he saw it. Augustus could have restored the Republic. He was in a position to. He did not. Whether out of personal preservation or simply because he thought, I'm the only one who can save Rome, and that's not out of line with his massive ego, he took all the power, undermined the institutions of Rome, undermined the rule of law, and there you go. But, I mean, how are you going to avoid the kind of chaos that started with Sulla. Sulla saw a government he didn't like, saw things happening that he didn't like. And rather than using the institutions of the rule of law to address them, he just used brute force. Well, when there are no institutions of rule of law available for you to use, and you see something happening you don't like, I mean, there you go, right? You're gonna kill the guy, right? What do you do with an emperor you don't like? Friggin' kill him. It took them a while for them to get the courage, or maybe it took them a while for things to get bad enough that somebody just decided to go for it. But once everybody was like, oh shit, we can just kill this guy, it happened a lot. And I mean a lot. There was one period in Rome of 40 some odd years where there were like 50 emperors, right? That's crazy. Less than a year apiece, right? There was 1 year where there were 7 emperors in 1 year. Somebody in a previous class asked me, at that point, like, who would want to be emperor? Right? Who would even take that job? Well, it becomes a self-perpetuating problem, right? Because you have to be pretty damn stupid to take the job in the first place. And if you're pretty damn stupid, you're not going to do a good job and you're going to piss somebody off. And in this regime, in this era in Rome, when you piss somebody off, you get killed. So it's not a good look, right? It's not good. So anyway, did I say crisis of the 2nd century? It's crisis of the 3rd century. I don't know where my head's at. You're like, oh, of course. You're all laughing at me because you're like, he said crisis of the 2nd century. Anyway. So, Rome finally manages to get a couple of good emperors, sort of by luck, after the crisis of the 3rd century. But by this point, things are pretty bad, right? It's in an economic crisis. The empire is huge. I don't want to go into the political economics of the classical world, but the short version is, because of Rome's economic system and the way that they handle government finances, they had kind of dug themselves into a hole, right? This hole could have been addressed by changing their system of taxation and instituting, say, land reform and sort of balancing the economy so that it didn't favor the wealthy so much. But it's not a Republican government anymore. It's literally just the emperor doing whatever he wants, and the emperor is pretty much always someone who came from the ranks of the wealthy and who needs the backing of the wealthy to survive. Not that the emperors can get to survive very long on the average anyway, but still. They come out of the crisis of the 3rd century with a couple of good emperors, only to be confronted by a different sort of crisis, which is, say, pressure on their northeastern border. Now, this is a little complex, and I may go into it in more detail in another video, but the long and the short version is, in what they call Gaul, and what we would now call Germany, the Roman border ended at the Rhine and the Danube rivers. Now, the Rhine runs basically from north to south from the coast, the northern coast of Germany on the North Sea, down to, well, it ends up in the Alps. And the Danube runs pretty much west to east, towards what we now call Eastern Europe, down towards the Black Sea. So there's sort of a little L shape you can see that these rivers form, kind of. And the Romans had never really managed to push past the Rhine or the Danube, all that successfully. Now, living on the other side were the tribespeople of this area, the Gallic tribesmen. And there were lots of different tribes, Germanic tribes, that operated on a kind of simple kingship system, almost a tribal chieftainship system. I haven't talked about that much, but just go with me in that it was more or less simple kingship. All adult males were fighting males. There was a king who was effectively both a war leader and a spiritual leader. This was the essence of the Germanic system. Now, the Romans found themselves in conflict with a lot of these Germanic tribes. They had been briefly united by a guy called Vercingetorix, whom Caesar defeated and brought home to Rome to be executed. But if you remember, one of the crimes Caesar was accused of was going to war on a tribe that was allied with Rome. Now, the way these alliances worked was that the Romans pretty quickly figured out that they could not fight all of the tribes at once, or that if they did, it would be really annoying and difficult. But they also knew that the tribes had their own beefs with each other. And that since the Romans practiced intensive agriculture, they practiced, the settled arts. They had specialists, they had urban populations, they could produce complex metalworks and artworks and things like that. They could produce finished goods that were highly sophisticated. The Germanic tribespeople did not practice this. They lived, I don't know if you've ever seen Germany or been there, but in its native state, it is heavily forested. And it is not suitable for intensive agriculture without being cleared. So the Germanic tribes practiced something called extensive agriculture. Also, they didn't have the technology for intensive agriculture, but that's another thing. What that means is they were sort of semi-nomadic. They would set up in an area and prepare it for cultivation. They would grow crops there in the same fields over and over for, 5, 10, 15 years. And then as the soil became exhausted, because they didn't rotate their crops, they would cut everything down, set it on fire to create a layer of ash that would regenerate the soil, and they would move, the whole tribe, they would move to a different location, not too far away, and set up and start all over again. And they would kind of rotate. They might return to their original fields in, a generation or two. So extensive agriculture does not produce nearly the surplus that intensive agriculture does, and therefore you cannot sustain nearly the population of specialists. So it's very similar to pastoralism in that sense. And what the Romans realized is that they could produce goods that the Germanic tribespeople wanted, that they had no capacity to produce themselves. So, the tribes living closest to the river, especially the Rhine River, were sort of recruited as allies. They were made into what the Romans would have called federati, the allied tribes. And so you can imagine the Rhine River. You can see across it fairly easily on a good day. It's at various parts of it. You can imagine the Rhine River, and on one side, on the western bank, there are Roman watchtowers and Roman walls and Roman settlements, military encampments. And on the eastern bank, there are the federati, the allied tribes and their settlements, right, and their little encampments. And they would trade with each other. The allied tribes would receive payments in goods and coin in return for service at keeping the tribes that were hostile to Rome away from the border. Okay, so this was the kind of arrangement Rome had come to secure their northeastern border, because they had pushed all the way out into what we now call Germany, but they couldn't conquer the whole damn thing, and that was kind of unusual for Rome. And then they were left kind of hanging out in the wind. They were like, shit, now what? Right? So this was their way of doing it. Anyway, all of this is in service of setting us up for the 4th century, the 300s, when we get movements by a group of horse nomads from, I guess, somewhere around like the Ukraine, Uzbekistan, that sort of area, like southern Russian steppes, that kind of thing. And they began pushing westward, raiding the more settled communities for their goods, for their food, and conquering them and subjugating them to grow food for them. This is a common pattern with nomadic societies, because if extensive agriculturalists have a lower margin of surplus than intensive agriculturalists, then nomads have an even lower margin of surplus. They're effectively hunter-gatherers when it comes to non-meat, so they spend a lot of time raiding. It's sort of their pattern of survival. If they're next to a society that has more food and more finished goods than they do, they will just come take them. So, okay. So these people were called the Huns, and they were also pushing eastward into China, and they were pushing southward into the Fertile Crescent. They were everywhere. They were huge. There's a lot going on. Well, less southward. That would be Genghis Khan later on. But anyway, they were pushing eastward into China and westward into the lands of these Germanic tribespeople. And so the Germanic tribespeople did what any sensible people would do in the face of this oncoming onslaught. They moved. Remember, they're extensive agriculturalists. They already are used to moving every few years anyway. They picked up their shit and they moved. Where are they going to move? They're not going to move south. Rather, they moved west, towards the Danube. Moving south had its own problems. I'll talk about that later. Although some of them did go that way, I guess. But many of them moved west. Enough of them that was a problem. Because then they're taking up space that other Germanic tribes needed. And so those Germanic tribes moved west, away from the oncoming horde of Huns. And eventually, you see where this is going, they're going to run smack dab into that border, the Rhine River and the federated tribes, the allied tribes. Now what happens then? Rome has a crisis on its hands. Either it can fight back against this movement and try to wipe out the tribes coming close, but one of the reasons it allied itself with these Germanic tribes in the first place is because that was infeasible to sustain in the long run. So, one solution was to allow some of the allied tribes, the Federati, to move westward across the Rhine and into Roman territory. I mean, by this point, they spoke Latin anyway. A lot of them dressed in Roman clothes. They ate Roman foods. They were practically Roman. So you could just let them move in and then make allies out of the new arrivals, right? And if you keep this up for a while, it'll be fine. The problem is, of course, there's always going to be people who don't want to let the new folks in. right? And some emperors were content to allow the federated tribes, the federati, to move in to Roman territory and settle and sort of assimilate as Romans, and others were not. Now, when the Germanic tribes got turned away, oftentimes they would cross anyway, and the emperor would send out armies to try to kill them. So now we have battles being fought in Roman territory for the first time in God knows how long. That's not a civil war, right? The last time Roman territory was invaded probably goes back to the Punic Wars with Carthage. But of course, the fact is it wasn't an invasion in the traditional sense. The Germanic tribes were not looking to conquer Rome. They literally wanted to become a part of Rome. They moved into Roman territory to become Romans. And had they been allowed to settle peacefully, there would have been no issues, most likely, or very few. But instead, what happens is a series of alternating peaceful interactions with newly arriving tribes and hostile interactions, just depending on who happened to be the emperor at the moment, or even depending upon the local generals and how they felt. The hostile interactions often ended badly for the newly arriving Germanic tribespeople, but not always, because there were lots of them, and they were used to fighting. Many of them had served in the Roman military. Federated allied Germans had been recruited to bolster the manpower of the Roman military for, decades at this point, maybe even centuries. So they understood Roman military techniques. They had the discipline and the materials they needed to fight well. And this is how we get to ultimately, first of all, the first bad thing that happened was a tribe that moved west across the Rhine and were chased out of what we would now call France, across the Pyrenees, the mountains that separate France from Spain, into Hispania, the Roman territory that we would call Spain, and they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, the narrow strip of the Mediterranean Sea between Spain and North Africa, and basically took over. They crashed Roman rule in North Africa and effectively took over North Africa from Rome. These people were destructive. They did manage to also sack Rome, I think, at one point. The Romans were scared of them. They considered them violent and like boogeymen, almost, even though, frankly, if you had just given them some land and let them farm, it would never have been a problem. But, what do I know? A lot, as it turns out. But, so much so that the name of this tribe has been associated with wanton destruction ever since. The tribe was called the Vandals. That's correct. A Vandal, someone who vandalizes something, who messes it up, who destroys it, who defaces it. A Vandal is called so after a member of this tribe that the Romans were so terrified of, that caused so much damage, and that basically wrested a portion of Rome's empire away from it. This was the first domino falling in a series of terrible events. In the coming years, as we move into the 300s, as we're going through the 300s and into the 400s, Rome would be sacked by Germanic barbarians who they managed to piss off for one reason or another several times. So where was the emperor in all this? Well, here's the thing. In the 300s, the Emperor Constantine moved, he didn't move the capital, he kind of established a new capital in the eastern part of the Roman Empire, in a little fishing town that he rebuilt as an imperial capital and called it after himself, Constantine. sorry, he was Constantinople. In Greek, the city of Constantine. Now, this was in Greece, in the eastern part of mainland Greece. And why did Constantine do that? Well, he had a couple of reasons. First of all the money was in the east. The western part of the Fertile Crescent, mainland Greece, Egypt, all the money was in, all the real money-making opportunities for Rome were in the eastern part of the empire. So he wanted to be close to those. But also, a new Persian empire was arising. The Achaemenid Empire was arising in the further east, east of the Fertile Crescent. And they were conquering shit, and he needed to be close to the enemy to fight them effectively. Future emperors would continue to concentrate on the eastern part of the empire. There was also an emperor in Rome, which would be weird. It would be like having a president in Los Angeles and one in Washington. That'd be strange. But anyway. Which one's in charge, right? Well, in this case, it was clearly the Eastern Emperor who was in charge, and the Western Emperor and the Western Empire itself was sort of left to fend for itself. It was sort of left to its own devices. It had less money. Since it was no longer the actual center of government, the money that would have been flowing into Rome from Egypt, from Syria, from Palestine, from Greece, was now flowing into Constantinople instead. So the Western Roman Empire and the city of Rome itself is becoming poorer. It is losing its ability to defend its borders. It's losing its ability to defeat the incoming Germanic tribes people that are disrupting things. Rome is sacked as pissed off Germans rampage through the city, looting and burning several times. Until finally, we get to what many think of as the fall of the Roman Empire, 476, where Odoacer, a German tribesperson, kills, they sack Rome, the emperor is dead, and that's it. The thing is, I don't think you can fix a precise date to the fall of Rome necessarily. Because, where would I put it? The social institutions of Rome were undermined all the way back with Sulla in like the 2nd century BCE or early first century. We're now in CE, or what we used to call AD. Back still in BCE, you've got Caesar, who does essentially the same thing Sulla did. Octavian, who became Augustus, the first emperor. He could have restored the institutions of rule of law. He did not. And then when they figured out you could just kill the emperor, well, hell, man. Emperors started dying off left and right. When did Rome fall? It was falling for a long time, right? It wasn't a fall. They didn't fall. They sort of slowly slid off the couch, right? And the institutions of Rome, the Senate, was still meeting through all of this. It had zero actual power, but it still met. Why? Because it always had, right? Ever since they kicked out the king in 500 BCE or thereabouts, it had always met. But it didn't mean anything. Right? The average person might have looked at it and thought, hey, everything's going fine. The Senate is meeting. We're having elections. Everything is normal. But it wasn't normal. The rule of law was gone. The economic situation was in a death spiral. Emperors were incompetent and routinely assassinated. The military had all the power. They were effectively an autocracy with no autocrat. It was all the middle management layer of autocracy. It was crazy stuff. The empire was falling for a long time. And then the Germanic tribes people. start moving in. They start settling and practicing intensive rather than extensive agriculture and taking advantage of the more sophisticated material arts available to the Romans. Odoacer was a German tribesman, yes. But Odoacer had also been a career Roman military man. Right? He served a career in the Roman military before rejoining his people as a leader. He spoke Latin. And when he took over Rome, he wrote letters to the Eastern Emperor promising to govern in his name. Right? Odoacer acted as though he was the next Roman emperor. So did Rome fall? Right then? I don't know. The guy in charge spoke Latin, had served in the Roman military, and was ruling in the name of the Eastern Emperor. That's like everybody else before him. It just so happens that this guy was German by birth rather than Roman by birth. Had Rome fallen? I don't know. But certainly Rome had fallen by the time we get to the early 500s, the early 6th century. Because Odoacer was not able to stabilize the empire any better than anyone else. Maybe less so, because not being Roman by birth, being German by birth instead, the Roman nobility, or what was left of them, was not wild about supporting this guy. And by the early 500s, the emperor, the next supposed emperor anyway, was dead and nobody bothered to pick up the post, right? There wasn't even a situation with Odoacer where he writes to the Eastern Emperor and says, I'll rule in your name. It was just, nobody bothers. Everybody's left to their own devices. So, try to imagine what it's like, if you could have lived through this whole period, which it took place on a time scale that would have been several generations. So maybe let's think of like you and your children and their children. And you're living in a city that is not in Italy, but maybe North Italy or southern Germany in Roman territory. And you start off living there, and the mail gets delivered, and you know that just north of you there's a Roman military encampment protecting the border, and you have representatives from the central government who come occasionally. People collect taxes. You've got all the usual bureaucratic officials. The Roman religions are observed, so on and so forth. And then in your children's time, there aren't as many soldiers on the border anymore. A lot of them have left. Why? They weren't getting paid. Why weren't they getting paid? The tax collector isn't coming around anymore. He wasn't getting paid either. Right? They can't enforce the law. The Roman officials are trying their best to maintain what's going on, but when they write to Rome for more funds to solve a problem or to repave the roads or to get an official out to help them with something, nobody answers. It's chaos down there. Nobody knows who the emperor is today. Everybody's fighting over it. They're too busy to answer letters from this little podunk town, right? So they muddle through as best they can. They're trying to figure out who to listen to, who's in charge, right? You're maintaining the Roman traditions as best you can. There's a Christian church in town now. They've got their own thing going on, so you kind of do that. Some Germans are moving in. They seem pretty tough. They seem pretty together. They stick together, but they've got their shit together. And maybe if you can't get help from Rome, you appeal to the local German tribes people, the head of the local German tribe, right? Maybe he can get stuff done for us. And he does. And the Germans are Christian, so they want you to all be Christians. So, what the hell, right? You do that. And then in their children's time, nobody's heard from Rome or had any officials show up from Rome or tax collectors show up from Rome since your time, right? Not since my grandfather's time has this happened. The roads are no longer being restored, so they're no longer really useful as roads. So we just pull up the stones and use them to build things. Roman law, I guess, is kind of still in effect, but it's a lot more important what the Germans think, right? The Roman soldiers are gone. They've left. They weren't getting paid. They skedaddled. The only guys with swords who can protect you around anymore are the Germans. And so you listen to them. They don't know the Roman laws that well. They know their own laws. So the law of the land becomes the Germanic law, not the Roman law. They've got their own traditions. Right? You all still speak Latin, or at least kind of. You're a pretty podunk town anyway, so maybe your Latin wasn't that proper to begin with. But now, and especially, with things being pretty dicey as far as your safety goes, you get raided sometimes by other tribes, which would have never happened in your grandfather's time. But you get raided sometimes. People die, crops are destroyed, food shortages are more common. You can't maintain a big surplus population of specialists. The people who were literate, most of the books got burned in that raid a couple of years ago anyway, and the people who were literate have no one to write to. Who are they going to write to? The Roman government? It's not answering. They start farming, the hard work of farming, the ones that survive, and they don't have time to keep up with their reading and writing skills. Maybe there are some people who are still functionally literate, but for the most part, even the ones who used to be aren't anymore. A dimly remembered skill from their youth that they haven't used in decades. Like long division. No, I'm kidding. That's how Rome falls. That's how Rome goes away. It's not a fall. It's a slow slide to the floor. That's how Rome falls. The institutions are eroded. They lose their power to compel and command. The economic situation worsens as a result. The chaos at the border and within the borders becomes more frequent and more dangerous because without the institutions of law and order to compel and command soldiers, they cannot provide security to their citizens. There was a time, it was said, when a Roman citizen could walk from London to Cairo in Egypt on Roman roads and not fear retribution because of the might of the Roman army and the effectiveness it had at safeguarding its citizens. But those times are long gone. The Roman government itself can't accomplish anything. Nobody even knows who the emperor is today until there isn't one, right? And by that time, most of the outlying cities and towns have been on their own for a long time. Urban populations shrink as food shortages grow more frequent and margins of surplus grow thinner thanks to all the chaos and instability. And people abandon the urban centers to go farm, or they just die either way. Populations of specialists vanish. Skills are lost. The Romans had the secret of concrete, Roman concrete, which allowed them to build all kinds of impressive structures. That skill was lost for a long time in the fall of the Roman Empire. The people who knew how to do it died off without teaching the right people, and then you have a whole population who are living in and amongst buildings that they could not themselves recreate if they had to. When those buildings crumbled, if they did, they were replaced by inferior wooden replacements. That's how the Roman Empire falls. Slowly, a little bit at a time, the systems degrade. And eventually, Rome means nothing. In the 1st century CE, Rome was a city of 1 million people. 1 million people, that's bigger than Tulsa. And they didn't even have Taco Bell or electricity. So pretty impressive, right? 1 million people. By the 5th century CE, 400 and some odd years later, Rome has maybe 1/10 of that population, probably less. Less than 100,000. Entire sections of Rome were empty, full of weeds and wild animals. It was said during this period that Rome, once an international city, where people from all over lived, you could hear a dozen languages spoken in the forum. It was the center of commerce, of culture, of intellectual activity. Rome, the eternal city. In the 5th century, it was said that the streets of Rome at night belong only to robbers and wolves. Wolves! There were sections of the city so abandoned that packs of wolves roamed the streets. That's how an empire falls. That's how the Roman Empire falls. So, we'll talk more about the consequences of the fall of Rome, how it relates to what's going on in the East, and how it leads into the medieval period in the next video, because this is damn near an hour. Feeling pretty good, feeling better. It's, my endurance is picking up, so this is good. And but still, I should stop now before I kill myself by accident. Take care, be well. It's going to be rainy and cold this week. Do what you got to do. We're almost there. Okay, bye.